The glass on the boardroom table was cracked because my thumb had not stopped pressing down for 4 minutes straight. Across the mahogany, 3 senior syndicate lieutenants sat frozen, their breathing shallow enough that I could hear the faint hum of the city lights outside the high-rise windows. They were waiting for me to give the order that would burn their smuggling roots to ash. They thought the tension in the room was about territory, money, or blood. They were fools. My phone buzzed against the polished wood, a single sharp vibration that severed the silence. The screen did not display a threat from a rival syndicate or a notice from a compromised port. It was a digital transfer from my private detail downstairs. A 30-second video file captured on a cheap phone camera inside a crowded, midtown bistro. I pressed play, and the cold calculation that kept my empire running evaporated, replaced by a sudden, violent heat in my chest that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the fact that someone had dared to torment my wife. There was no time for preamble, no room for slow world-building or gentle introductions, because down on that screen, Hannah was blinking back tears while 3 laughing strangers forced her to drop a tray of scalding plates just for their own amusement. "The car," I whispered. The lieutenants didn't move. They thought I was talking about the port raid. "The car," I said again, my voice dropping into that quiet register that made hardened killers check their pulse. "Now, before we dive deeper into how a single video can dismantle a man's restraint, let's take a quick pause. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the syndicate wars and the private battles behind closed doors only get darker from here. Now let me take you back to the foundation of what I built, and the one fragile, beautiful truth I kept hidden from the underworld. To the city outside, Mateo Kang was a ghost who settled turf wars without firing a public shot, a man whose reputation was built on the terrifying principle that he never threatened people twice. But to Hannah, I was simply the man who came home at night, unbuttoned his collar, and listened to her talk about the chaotic shifts at the restaurant where she worked. She was a chubby, beautiful woman with a fierce, unapologetic sense of self. She refused to use my name, refused to wear my rings in public, and demanded to earn every ounce of respect on her own 2 feet. I hated it. Every time she walked into that bistro wearing her apron, my protective instincts screamed, warning me that the world outside my guarded walls was full of shallow, vicious predators who measured human worth by a waistline or a paycheck. I honored her choice because I loved her too much to cage her, but tonight, that choice became a loaded gun pointed right at her dignity. Let's pause right here for a quick second. Smash that like button if you believe people should be judged by their character and not their appearance. And let me know in the comments how you think a room full of arrogant snobs reacts when a ghost walks through their door. On that screen in my office, the video continued to roll. A group of wealthy young patrons, people who thought their trust funds made them untouchable, were pointing their phones directly at Hannah as she picked up the shattered porcelain from the floor. One of them laughed, leaning back in his chair to tell her that nobody would ever believe her side of the story because she was just a waitress. Hannah didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just straightened her posture, looked that arrogant piece of filth dead in the eye, and whispered the warning that sealed their fate. "You should probably stop filming before my husband sees this." They laughed louder. They demanded to know who her imaginary husband was, and when she gave them my name, they brushed it off like dust. They didn't know the name Mateo Kang, but they were about to learn what happens when you wake a sleeping predator. The black town car cut through the midnight traffic with the silent, heavy precision of a predator closing in on wounded prey. In the back seat, my phone sat resting on my knee, the screen dark, but the image of Hannah's face burned into the back of my eyelids. People in my position learned early that power was currency. You bought silence, you bought loyalty, and you bought protection with blood or coin. But Hannah had rejected every single tenet of that philosophy. When we met 3 years ago, she didn't care about the syndicate safe houses, the armored vehicles, or the millions moving through offshore accounts. She saw a tired, cold man carrying the weight of a criminal underworld on his shoulders, and she offered him a home. She was a plus-size woman in a world obsessed with hollow perfection, yet she carried herself with a quiet, unshakable dignity that commanded the room without raising her voice. When she told me she wanted to keep working as a waitress, I fought her on it. I told her about the jackals, the snobs, and the people who looked down on anyone who didn't wear a designer label. "Them look," she had told me, her hand resting firmly against my cheek while my pulse hammered against my ribs. "If I hide behind your name, Mateo, I'll never know if I'm strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet. Let me have this." I had relented. It was the only weakness I ever allowed myself, giving her the freedom to walk unprotected into a society built entirely on cruelty. And now the bill had come due. Before we step through those restaurant doors and watch arrogant privilege shatter into dust, take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the reckoning you are about to see is just the beginning of how far a syndicate boss will go to defend his wife. The car slowed to a crawl outside the glass facade of the bistro. Through the tinted windows, I could see the warm lighting, the expensive wine glasses catching the glare of the chandeliers, and the small cluster of wealthy patrons laughing near the center tables. They were still celebrating their little victory, completely unaware that the clock had run out. My head of security shifted in the front seat, half turning around with his hand hovering near his coat. "Boss, do you want us to clear the room before you go in? Make sure there are no complications." "No," I said, my voice cutting through the interior with a cold finality that left no room for debate. "I go in alone." I pushed the door open, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped out onto the pavement. My tailored black suit felt heavy, the fabric stiff against shoulders that had carried the burdens of a criminal empire. But tonight, I wasn't an organization leader meeting with politicians or syndicates. I was a husband whose wife had been cornered by cowards. Let's take a quick pause right here. Drop a comment down below and let me know how satisfying it is when bullies realize their actions have real-world consequences. And while you're down there, smash that like button. I didn't rush. Speed was for men who panicked. True authority moved with the deliberate, terrifying weight of an avalanche. I pushed open the heavy glass double doors of the restaurant. The ambient chatter of the dining room, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of superficial conversations died instantly. The host started to step forward with a practiced, polite smile, expecting another late reservation, but one look at my face made the words die in his throat. He took 3 involuntary steps back, his eyes widening as he recognized the look of a man who belonged to a completely different world. I didn't look at him. My gaze locked straight ahead, scanning the tables until I found her. Hannah was standing near the service station, her apron smooth, her posture rigid. She was holding a fresh cloth, wiping down a surface with steady hands. But the moment the door swung shut behind me, her head snapped up. Our eyes met across the crowded room. For a fraction of a second, I saw the shock in her expression. Then her eyes softened with a silent warning, a desperate plea telling me not to burn the world down just yet. She didn't know that the world was already burning. The silence that fell over the bistro was heavy enough to suffocate. Every fork froze midair. Every superficial laugh dissolved into a nervous gulp as I walked down the center aisle. My shoes clicked against the polished floorboards, each step landing with the calculated rhythm of a death march. I didn't look at the owners, the terrified waiters, or the high society couples pressing themselves back against their leather banquettes. My eyes remained fixed on the table near the corner, the one littered with empty wine bottles, crumpled napkins, and the glowing screens of mobile devices. The 3 young men who had spent their evening turning cruelty into entertainment were still leaning back in their chairs, smug grins plastered across their faces. They assumed I was just another wealthy customer or a corporate executive dropping in for a late-night bite. They were too wrapped up in their own reflected privilege to see the trap closing around their necks. One of them, a blonde punk wearing an expensive designer jacket that screamed family money, waved a hand dismissively as I neared their table. "Hey, pal, you're blocking the light," he muttered, not even bothering to look up from his phone screen where the video of Hannah was still looping. "Move along. We're busy celebrating a very successful routine." I stopped. The air pressure in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked down at him, not with anger but with the detached, clinical curiosity of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. "The one who made my wife cry?" I asked. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried across the dead silence of the entire dining room like the crack of a whip. The blonde smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He blinked, looking up at my shoulders, my tailored suit, and finally into my eyes. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a magic trick. The laughter at the surrounding tables didn't just stop. It vanished entirely, replaced by the terrifying realization that the game was over. Before we watch how a syndicate boss handles entitled cowards without raising his voice, take a second to smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because the fallout from this moment is going to shake the city to its foundations. The young man tried to laugh it off, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. "Look, man, I don't know what you're talking about. It was just a joke, just a bit of fun with the help." The word help hung in the air like a foul odor. Across the room, Hannah took a sharp step forward, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Her eyes met mine, sending a clear, unyielding message across the space between us. "Do not destroy them yet. Make them understand." She had every right to let me wipe them off the map. She had every justification to watch me dismantle their futures, their bank accounts, and their arrogant little lives right here on the spot. But her restraint was staggering. Even now, after being humiliated, she refused to let me turn into the monster the underworld feared I was. "A joke," I repeated softly, tilting my head. I reached down, my fingers sliding over the edge of their table, and applied a fraction of pressure. The heavy mahogany groaned, glasses rattling violently against the wood. "You recorded a woman minding her own business, mocked her size, and forced her to drop a tray just to watch her scramble. You think that's a joke?" The blonde swallowed hard, his friends shrinking back into their seats, desperately trying to distance themselves from the disaster they had created. "We didn't know," one of them stammered, his hands shaking as he dropped his phone onto the table. "We swear we didn't know she was." "That's right," I interrupted, my voice dropping into a quiet, chilling register. "You didn't know because you judge human beings by what they weigh and what checks they cash. You thought she was defenseless." I straightened up, adjusting my cuffs, and turned my head slightly toward the shadow near the entrance where my head of security stood waiting. "Touch them," I ordered quietly, keeping my eyes locked on the trembling cowards in front of me. "Not yet." Security guard nodded once and faded back into the dark outside the glass doors. I looked back down at the blonde punk, whose expensive jacket now looked like a straitjacket. "You're going to sit right here. You're going to look at my wife. And you are going to listen very carefully to every word she has to say about the value of human dignity. Because if you interrupt her, or if you look away for even a single second, you won't have to worry about your trust funds ever again. You'll be worrying about whether your family remembers what you looked like before you left town." Hannah walked slowly out from behind the service station. She didn't look broken. She didn't look small. She walked with the absolute, unshakable gravity of a queen stepping onto a battlefield. She intended to rule. Hannah stopped 2 paces away from the table. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Every eye was locked on her, waiting to see how a woman who had just been treated like garbage would react when her husband held the reins of absolute power. The blonde punk and his friends looked up at her, their faces pale, sweating through their expensive designer clothes. They had spent the last hour treating her like an object, a fixture of the restaurant designed for their amusement. Now, standing under the cold, calm gaze of a man who controlled half the city's syndicates, they realized the horrifying scale of their miscalculation. Hannah looked down at them not with anger, but with a cold, piercing clarity. "You thought because I was standing behind a service station carrying plates that I had no name, no life, and no protection," Hannah said, her voice steady and clear, echoing off the high ceiling. "You thought my size and my apron made me invisible. You thought you could record my humiliation and post it online for your friends to applaud." Blonde opened his mouth, trying to find some shred of his arrogant bravado, but no words came out. He just swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward me and back to her. "I don't need my husband to break your bones or burn your homes to teach you a lesson," Hannah continued, stepping closer until her shadow fell over their table. Physical pain fades too quickly. Men like you forget bruises the second they heal. What you need to learn is what it feels like to have everything you take for granted stripped away by your own arrogance. I stood silently beside her, my hands resting at my sides, watching the way she commanded the room. Every instinct in my blood screamed to tear their world apart right then and there, to let the syndicate loose on their families and make them bleed for every tear they had caused. But watching Hana stand tall, refusing to let me become a mindless monster while still demanding absolute justice, stirred something far deeper in my chest than vengeance ever could. Before we watch the financial and social trap close around these cowards, make sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the dismantlement of a privileged dynasty is a masterclass in quiet leverage. Hana turned her head slightly toward me, her eyes softening just enough for me to see the deep, unwavering trust she placed in my hands. "Mateo, show them." I didn't smile. I just pulled my phone from my inner pocket, tapped the screen twice, and dialed a direct line to my chief financial strategist. "Execute Protocol 7, I said quietly into the speaker. Across the table, the color drained entirely from the blonde punk's face. His phone buzzed violently in his lap, followed immediately by the phones of his two companions. They pulled their devices out with shaking fingers, staring at the screens as text alerts and emergency emails flooded in. "What? What is this?" the blonde stammered, his voice trembling as he read the notification. "Our corporate accounts, our family trust assets, they're being frozen. The board just called an emergency meeting. They're removing my father from executive control." "Your family built a shipping empire on government contracts and imported luxury goods," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "My organization controls the logistics corridors that your cargo ships rely on to bypass port delays. It took my strategist 3 minutes to reroute your supply chain, flag your compliance records for federal review, and freeze every liquid asset your family holds." The restaurant remained dead silent. The diners at the surrounding tables stared in open shock, realizing that a single phone call from a syndicate boss had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar inheritance in real time. "You wanted viral entertainment." I stepped forward, resting my knuckles on their table, leaning down until our faces were inches apart. "You wanted a video to show off your power over a working woman. Fine. The security footage from this restaurant, along with the raw files from your own phones, has already been sent to every major media outlet and your family's primary investors. By morning, your names won't be associated with wealth or status. You'll be the poster children for corporate negligence and public humiliation." Blonde slumped back in his chair, completely broken. The illusion of untouchable privilege had evaporated, leaving behind 3 terrified boys who finally understood the weight of the world they lived in. Hana looked down at them one last time, her expression impassive. Then she turned away from the table, untied her restaurant apron, and let it drop onto the floor. "Let's go home, Mateo," she said softly. I looked at the cowards once more, offering a single nod of cold confirmation, before turning on my heel to walk beside my wife out of the restaurant, leaving their shattered empire smoking in our wake. The ride back to our estate was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating quiet. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the town car, casting long, fractured shadows across the leather interior. For anyone else in my position, tonight would have felt like a complete victory. The men who dared touch my wife had been financially dismantled, their family legacies cracked down the middle, and their arrogant public standing reduced to ash yet. As I glanced sideways at Hana sitting quietly in the corner of the seat, a cold, hollow ache settled deep in my chest. She was staring out the window, her hands resting calmly in her lap, completely detached from the absolute power I had just unleashed on her behalf. And that detachment terrified me more than any rival syndicate ever could. For years, I believed that love in my world meant building an impenetrable fortress around the people who mattered, arming myself to the teeth, and destroying anyone foolish enough to test my borders. I thought protection meant total annihilation. But as I watched Hana trace the outline of the window frame, I realized the horrifying truth of what had just happened. My world, my empire, and my lethal instincts were a cage. When we stepped through the heavy oak doors of our home, the silence of the massive, empty hallway felt deafening. There were no guards stationed inside this space, no flashing security monitors, and no whispers of betrayal echoing off the marble floors. It was just the two of us. Hana stopped near the foyer, unzipped her jacket, and let it slip onto the bench. She didn't look at the armored security panels or the private study where my syndicate ledgers were locked away. She turned around and looked directly into my eyes, her gaze steady, heavy, and completely unreadable. "You destroyed them in 3 minutes," Hana said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried more weight than 100 courtroom verdicts. "They deserved worse," I replied, stepping closer, my voice dropping instinctively as I sought to justify the violence simmering beneath my skin. "They humiliated you. They thought your size and your job made you small. I reminded them who controls the ground they stand on." "What did that make you, Mateo?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stopped dead in my tracks, my jaw tightening as the words hung between us. "It made me your husband," I said, my voice hardening defensively. "It made me a man protecting his wife from jackals who thought they could treat her like garbage," Hana said softly, shaking her head as a melancholic smile touched the corners of her lips. "It made you default to the monster they expect a mafia boss to be. Every time someone crosses us, your first instinct is to burn their world to the ground, tear down their families, and prove your dominance through absolute terror. You think you're saving me, Mateo, but sometimes you look at the world through a scope that only knows how to kill." Silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on my shoulders with a force that 3 wars and a dozen betrayal investigations could never match. She walked past me, her footsteps light against the stone floor, heading toward the kitchen. I didn't follow her immediately. I stood alone in the grand hallway, looking at the high ceilings, the expensive art, and the sprawling estate I had spent my entire life fortifying. It was a fortress designed to keep everyone out, but standing here tonight, I realized it had also become a prison that kept my humanity locked away. For years, I told myself that my coldness was a shield, that my ruthless control was the only thing keeping Hana safe from the predators outside. But tonight, she had walked into that restaurant, faced down her tormentors with her own unshakable dignity, and proven that she possessed a strength far greater than my entire criminal empire combined. She didn't need my billions. She didn't need my syndicates, my port access, or my frozen corporate assets. She had survived with her head held high before I ever stepped through those doors. The devastation wasn't that the enemies had won. The devastation was realizing that my need for vengeance had blinded me to the very truth that made Hana extraordinary. Her worth was never defined by my power, and my protection was never a substitute for her own unbreakable spirit. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen, the weight of the dark descent settling over me, knowing that the hardest battle of my life wasn't about to be fought against a rival syndicate. It was about proving to the woman I loved that I could be a man worthy of her restraint. The kitchen was dark save for the amber glow under the counter cabinets. Hana was standing by the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil, her back to me. She hadn't locked herself away in the bedroom, nor had she retreated behind silence. She was simply existing in the space we shared, waiting to see if the man she married was capable of looking past his own reflection in the mirror of his power. I stopped at the doorway, my hands resting flat against the doorframe. "You think I'm afraid of your world, Mateo," she said softly, not turning around. "You think every time I walk out those front doors, I'm stepping into a minefield where I need a syndicate watching my back to survive. You saw what happened tonight," I answered, my voice tight. "The world out there is full of vultures who measure people by their size, their wealth, and their social standing. If I don't keep them away, they will tear you apart." Hana turned off the burner, the sudden click of the switch cutting through the quiet. She turned around, leaning back against the counter, and looked straight at me. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, heavy sorrow that cut deeper than any knife. "No, Mateo. The vultures are out there, yes," she said, her voice steady. They always will be. But when you respond to every insult with total annihilation, you aren't just keeping them away. You're trapping yourself in a cycle where you can never trust anyone, where every person you meet is either a threat to be eliminated or an asset to be controlled. That's not protection. That's isolation. The word struck a nerve so raw it felt like burning salt. For 10 years, I had climbed to the top of the underworld precisely because isolation felt safe. If no one got close, no one could betray you. If no one knew your vulnerabilities, no one could exploit them. I had built an empire out of cold stone and calculated fear, believing that my ruthlessness was the armor keeping my soul intact. But standing here in the dim light of our kitchen, looking at the woman who had walked into the darkest corners of my life and demanded nothing except that I be human, I realized the armor had become a cage. I had no defense against her logic because she was right. My instant resort to freezing accounts and threatening destruction wasn't just about defending her dignity. It was about my own desperate, compulsive need to control an uncontrollable world. The silence dragged on, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. I couldn't buy my way out of this realization. I couldn't threaten my way into her forgiveness. "If I don't fight," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, "if I don't make them bleed for what they did to you, I feel like I'm failing you, like I'm standing by while someone spits on everything we are." Hannah pushed off the counter and walked slowly across the kitchen toward me. She stopped just inches away, looking up into my face. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out, her warm palm resting flat against my chest, right over my hammering heart. "You didn't fail me tonight, Mateo," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "When you walked into that restaurant, I didn't want you to destroy them because I was helpless. I wanted you to see that I didn't need a monster to save me. I needed a partner who trusted me to handle my own battles, and a husband who could love me enough to walk away from the blood." Her touch burned through my suit, through my shirt, and straight down to the frozen core of my chest. "If you want to protect me," she continued softly, "don't burn the city down every time someone is cruel. Just be here. When the doors are locked and the world is shut out, just be the man who comes home to me." Last remnants of the cold, untouchable syndicate boss fractured and fell away, leaving behind something terrifying, raw, and entirely real. I reached out, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled her into my arms, burying my face against her shoulder as the dark descent finally hit rock bottom. And for the first time, I didn't try to fight my way back up. The morning light cut through the high windows of my private office, casting long, sharp beams across the mahogany desk where the syndicate reports sat untouched. For the first time in over a decade, I hadn't slept. I spent the hours before dawn sitting in the dark armchair across from Hannah's side of the bed, watching her sleep, watching the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, realizing how close I had come to trading her genuine, unshakable strength for the hollow comfort of my own ruthless control. My phone chimed against the wood. It was an encrypted message from my chief lieutenant detailing the fallout from the previous night. The wealthy family shipping empire was still in freefall. Their stock values had plummeted overnight, their federal compliance audits had been fast-tracked, and the video of their arrogant humiliation in the bistro had already broken across public networks, turning their high society names into a cautionary tale about corporate cruelty. The justice had been delivered. The debt had been paid in full. Yet, as I stared at the screen, the hollow victory tasted like dust. A knock echoed softly at the heavy office door before it swung open. Hannah walked in, wearing an oversized cotton sweater holding 2 mugs of black coffee. She didn't look like the wife of a feared underworld kingpin. She looked like herself, grounded, unapologetic, and completely radiant. She set a mug down on the edge of my desk, her eyes scanning the untouched files and the dark circles under my eyes. "Still fighting the war in your head," she said quietly, leaning her hip against the corner of the desk. "I'm looking at what's left of them," I replied, my voice raspy. "They broke every rule of decency when they targeted you. Part of me still wants to tear down the rest of their corporate board just to make sure they never forget your name." Hannah reached out, her warm fingers wrapping gently around my hand, pulling my grip away from the mouse. "They won't forget my name, Mateo," she said softly. a faint, confident smile touching her lips. Not because you destroyed them, but because I stood right in front of them and refused to shrink. My dignity didn't come from your bank accounts or your syndicate's leverage. It came from inside me. She squeezed my hand tighter, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made every defensive wall I had built over a lifetime crumble to dust. I don't need an army to keep me safe from small people, Matteo. I just need the man I love to realize that true strength isn't about how many enemies we crush beneath our boots. It's about choosing restraint when the whole world expects you to be a monster. The choice was laid bare before me. I could continue living as the ghost who ruled the shadows through fear, or I could step into the light beside the woman who had taught me what real power looked like. I stood up from the desk, wrapping my arms around her waist, burying my face in her hair as the last of the ice around my heart melted away. "Okay," I whispered against her shoulder. "No more shadows. Today, the world sees who you've been standing beside all along." Annual Metropolitan Chamber Gala was the epicenter of high society influence, a suffocating room filled with the city's elite, corporate tycoons, and political power brokers draped in diamonds and tailored silk. For years, I avoided these gatherings, preferring to rule my empire from the shadows where light could not expose the machinery of my trade. But tonight, the rules were different. The heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the restless murmur of hundreds of conversations died instantly. I walked down the central red-carpeted aisle, clad in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored black suit, my expression completely emotionless. But I was not walking alone. Hannah walked beside me. She wore a stunning, deep emerald gown that caught the chandelier light, moving with an absolute, unshakable grace that commanded the entire room. She didn't shrink under the collective gaze of the city's most judgmental snobs. She held her head high, her presence radiating a quiet, undeniable authority. Whispers rippled through the crowd like static electricity. "Isn't that? Isn't that the waitress from the bistro?" A panicked voice whispered near the front tables. "Quiet, you fool," another hissed back, recognizing my face instantly. "That's Matteo Kang." Realization swept through the ballroom in waves. The high society figures who spent their days sneering at anyone who didn't carry an inherited fortune suddenly watched as the most feared, untouchable man in the city offered his arm to the very woman they had mocked, marginalized, and underestimated. We stopped near the dais at the center of the room, beneath the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The organizers, trembling slightly, scrambled to clear a path, terrified of making a single misstep in our presence. I turned, my gaze sweeping across the sea of pale, anxious faces in the crowd, including the disgraced family whose shipping empire was still crumbling from yesterday's frozen assets. They stared in horror, realizing that the plus-size waitress they had tormented for fun was standing at the absolute center of power, arm in arm with the king of the underworld. I raised my glass slightly, the ice clinking against the crystal, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "You all spend your lives measuring people by what they weigh, what checks they cash, and what titles they inherit," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous hall without a hint of a shout. "You build your little worlds on cruelty, thinking privilege makes you untouchable." I looked down at Hannah, the coldness in my chest completely replaced by a profound, unshakable pride. My wife spent years working on her own feet, earning her own respect and refusing to hide behind my name. She didn't need my empire to prove her worth. But let this room be a reminder to everyone here. You cross the people she loves, or you mistake her grace for weakness, and you will learn what it means to face a reckoning you cannot buy your way out of. Silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one breathed. No one dared look away. Hannah stepped forward, resting her hand gently over mine on the stem of the glass, bringing a quiet, radiant warmth into the coldest room in the city. The applause that finally broke the silence of the grand ballroom didn't come from genuine admiration. It came from the heavy, shivering realization of survival. The elites, the politicians, and the corporate cowards clapped because they understood that the hierarchy they had built on arrogance and exclusion had just been shattered from the inside out. I didn't care about their applause. I didn't care about their fear. As the gala continued around us, Hannah and I stepped away from the crowd. moving past the glittering chandeliers and out through the tall glass doors toward the quiet terrace overlooking the city skyline. The night air was cool, carrying the distant, muted hum of traffic and the steady rhythm of a metropolis that never truly slept. Hannah leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the sparkling lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The emerald gown caught the moonlight, but it was the quiet, absolute peace in her posture that caught my attention. She hadn't asked for the spotlight tonight. She hadn't wanted the cameras or the terrified glances of the city's elite. But she had taken her place beside me not as a trophy of my power, but as an equal partner who had tamed the most dangerous man in the city simply by teaching him how to love without destroying. I stepped up behind her, wrapping my arms gently around her waist and resting my chin against her shoulder. "You didn't have to wear the crown tonight," I murmured, my voice losing the cold edge that had defined my entire life. Hannah leaned back against my chest, her hands covering mine where they rested over her heart. "I didn't wear a crown, Mateo. I just reminded them that I never needed yours to be standing here. For a man who had built an empire on blood, silence, and absolute control, those words were the only redemption I would ever need." I had spent years believing that strength meant standing alone at the top of a mountain of corpses, keeping the world at bay with a loaded gun. But looking at Hannah, feeling the steady, unyielding warmth of her presence, I finally understood the truth. True strength wasn't about the enemies you crushed or the syndicates you ruled. It was about choosing restraint, choosing partnership, and knowing that no matter how dark the world outside became, you had someone waiting at home who loved you not for your power, but for the man you chose to be when you laid your weapons down. Before we close the chapter on this syndicate empire and look ahead to the next dark romance battle, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and turn on notifications. Because the underworld never truly sleeps, and the next story of power, betrayal, and redemption is already waiting in the shadows. Let me know in the comments below what you think happens when the next rival syndicate tries to test the boundaries of a king who learned how to show mercy. The city lights flickered below us, indifferent to the lives changing in the dark. But inside this quiet space, the war was over. And as we turned away from the terrace to head back inside, I knew that as long as Hannah walked beside me, I would never need to rule through fear again.